only use the facts. To which Holmes replies, some facts should be suppressed, or at least a just sense of proportion should be observed in treating them. And I thought, you know, that is what we have so often done in Adventist history, either suppressed the facts or failed to give a just sense of proportion in treating those facts. So anyway, then I noticed something else very interesting, because earlier on I had listened to and partially read all of Charles Dickens' books. And so I'm reading in Sherlock Holmes, and I see a sentence that reads, "See how the yellow fog swirls down the street and drifts across the dun-colored houses." Yellow fog, I say, yellow fog. Where have I heard yellow fog? The yellow fog that rubs its back upon the window panes, the yellow smoke that rubs its muzzle on the window panes, licked its tongue into the corners of the evening, lingered upon the pools that stand in drains, let fall upon its back the soot that falls from chimneys, slipped by the terrace, made a sudden leap, and seeing that it was a soft October night, curled once around the house and fell asleep. Okay, who wrote that?
Sandburg.
Huh?
Wasn't it Sandburg?
No, no.
It's about Chicago.
No, it's not about Chicago. No, it's about London.
T.S. Eliot?
T.S. Eliot, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. Now, you know, it's interesting because, and then I said, well, now is Doyle echoing Charles Dickens? Because Doyle's writing is very much like Dickens. It's very flowery and lots of polysyllabic words and everything. So I went back to Dickens and I said, can I find yellow fog in Charles Dickens? Well, sure enough, the window blinds as yellow as November fogs. That's a passage from Chisholm. So you see this, anybody who's lived in London during that time when the streetlights would emit a yellowish light, you know, and then the fog would look yellow. And so you have these, the history of these, of this literature moving along. And of course I like Sherlock Holmes because I like detective stories and the kind of logic and reasoning that they use. So there we have it, Sherlock Holmes and Louis Sheaf. God bless you if you read even one of these books we recommended this morning.
Elementary, my dear.
Yes. You're welcome.
By the way, I think, Donna, you're thinking of one about the fog comes in on cat's paws.
Yeah, that's right. That is Sandburg. But that's the
that's what I thought.
That's the wrong book about it. That's the wrong poem about fog.
Yeah.
Well, he may be picking up on T.S. Eliot.
Could be.
That could be. Okay. Next. Who is next?
I have a couple.
I have one right here, then I'll get to you.
It's okay.
Okay, so my name is Sarah Herman, for those who don't know me. And I haven't actually read this book. I've been desiring to read this book. It's by Jordan B. Peterson. It's called 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. And I've tried reading it. I get it from the library. I'm on hold again at the library. And I love the introduction written by someone else, who, you know, was a friend of Peterson's. But when I started the first chapter, he talks about these lobsters, and it's very difficult for me to get through. But I've heard from numerous sources that this is such a wonderful book, so I'm going to slog through it. Peterson is a clinical psychologist from Canada. He works at the University of Toronto, and his study is in abnormal social and personality psychology. And so Then a friend told me about a podcast. So he has a podcast, and I figured, well, podcasts are very similar to books. I think that should be included. So if you go to the Jordan Peterson podcast, if you have an iPhone, you can, you punch that purple button and it takes you to podcasts. There is an interview with Dr. Oz, and it's a lengthy interview. It's about 2 hours, maybe more. So, on a trip, it would be great. However, on a recent trip with my husband, because I really wanted him to listen to this, and I wanted to listen to it again with him and get his thoughts, he couldn't do it on the airplane because he's anxious on the airplane. And unfortunately, this man's voice made him more anxious. He's like, I cannot listen to this. This is just making me crazy. So, okay.
We have HIPAA here. We have.
Well, I think most people have a fear of flying, so I don't recommend it flying. But if you have a trip somewhere that's like 2.5 hours long and you want to just listen to something, it's these rules of life that one of the rules is raise your children to like them. And I haven't obviously read that chapter. But my thought of what the chapter is probably from the podcast, from his interview with Dr. Oz, was something about, you want people to like your children because then they'll help your children. And it's the idea that that people can mentor your children, not just you. And so you want people to like your children. And if you raise them, so you need to raise them so that at least you like them, so that other people will like them, and just not let them get away with stuff. He's somewhat politically incorrect and controversial, and I haven't quite figured out all the things that he's controversial about, because I'm not very political, especially in Canadian politics, but I guess there was something he said that was just really got him notoriety. So he's kind of the opposite of political correctness. He says things that are just outrageous. It sounds outrageous, but then he explains his thought behind it. So anyway, that's my recommendation, and hopefully I can read the book myself.
Oh, you want to?
Before.
Yeah, because you might know more about him.
He really is a cult hero just now, and he will be at the Fox Theater on January 24th.
Okay.
And he's well worth seeing, just to see his gestures. He talks like this, and his voice is really strange. He became famous in Canada because he revolted against the legally mandated proper way of speaking. And he just felt that political correctness had gone too far. So he's with like Sam Harris or Jonathan Haidt, people like that. Now he's a believer, Sam Harris isn't. Ben Shapiro. And these are really feisty, young, bright people. But I think one of the interesting things about Peterson is that he has taken his psychological skills and reread the old stories, including the ones in the Bible. And he has brought those stories to life in a way that's been very, very helpful to many people. So, yeah, and you can see him go on the internet, and you can see him all over the place.
Yes, he is a YouTube sensation right now.
He is.
I haven't watched any YouTubes. I only listen to the podcast.
Well, it's fun his debate with Sam Harris on whether there is a God is really worth watching. I think they went a couple of hours up at the University of British Columbia. So, yes, he is somebody to go see. We'll be there on January 24. I hope to see you.
Which Fox are we talking about?
Riverside.
Riverside. Okay.
Yeah, and David mentioned that he is a cult hero, and I was going to use that term too. And just a commercial on January 12th, is that the second Saturday of January? It's his book. It's going to be in the book club at Michael Orlich's place. So we've been reading that. So maybe you can come and get the book finished so that you...
Yeah, there you go. It's not. I wouldn't call it a light read,
No.
but I mean,
It's fun.
yeah. You can get through those dueling lobsters. After.
You're not. To you.
Well, on the note of politically incorrect, it leads right into the book I'm going to recommend, which is The Strange Death of Europe by Douglas Murray, who is an Englishman. That book's been on the New York Times bestseller list for months and months. It came out in 2017. And in it, he has a point of view. So recognize that when you begin the book. But it's very well written, as the Brits tend to do. And he's good with language. And what he documents and then interprets is the effect of immigration, particularly the immigration of Muslims into Europe. The subtitle of the book is the three I's. What is it? Immigration, Identity, and Islam. And he's suggesting that the death of Europe is basically by suicide, because unwilling to defend the fundamental values of Western civilization, in essence, with, kind of loaded with guilt and a sort of secularism that has pervaded society over a long period now. He thinks that Europe is almost disappearing in the sense that we tend to think of it as a set of countries with specific cultures, and mostly based, of course, on the legacy of Christianity. Then the two other books, and I think it would be a wonderful book to read and discuss, because it's not a long book, and it's riveting. And in it, of course, there is a little bit of cautionary. It's a bit of a cautionary tale for this country. The two biographies that I read David McCullough's biography of John Adams about 6 months ago, and I think it was really, really well done. And this is John Quincy, and it gives an interesting view of the second Adams president, much undervalued, and fascinating. Just reading about his education makes you tired, realizing the kind of material that he was able to put into his head. And I've just started another biography of Thomas Cromwell, and that is also proving now, the first 100 pages, to be something that's hard to put down. So again, I recommend both of those.
Recently, I read a list of the presidents on their IQs, and they listed John Quincy Adams as probably number one.
Yeah, I would guess from reading about him that would certainly be true. Yeah.
Anybody else here that let me get him first.
I read recently Protest and Progress by Calvin Rock, and it struck me as a history of the interaction between the African American segment of the church, the leaders of that, and the leaders of the white church. I think it's a book that is generous in the comments that it's made. It takes the overview, it doesn't get into the dirt, and it is well footnoted, and for me, it gave me a perspective that I needed. Let me give you some background to that. Desmona and I came to the United States, to Cleveland in 1967. We arrived in September, November. The first black mayor of an American large city was elected. I was doing a course later in that year when the first take-home exam, in which I was working at home because they were extensive, Martin Luther King was assassinated. The second take-home exam that I was working on at home, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. Then that summer, the Cleveland-Glenville riots occurred. And we were introduced to some of the convulsions because we found the white church to be very prejudiced. And so we would, from time to time, in fact quite often, we'd go to Sabbath school and church at the white church, and then we'd go to the black church where they were still working their way through the preliminaries. And we became, we were invited home to lunch. We became friends, particularly with one of the pastors, Isaac Lester, and his family. And so we had some insight from there. And then on this campus, I was one of the ones who sought to bring more diversity into the research program on this campus and set out deliberately to recruit minority faculty, including Hansel Fletcher, Carlos Casiano. And so I got some insight into the difficulties that they were facing. But Kelvin Rock's book took all these pieces that I had seen and put them together like putting a jigsaw together. And I think this is going to be a very valuable history for the church in times to come. It's published by Andrews University Press.
What's the title again?
Protest and Progress.
And here it is.
And Calvin Rock was the chair of our board
Yes.
for many, many years.
Very good one.
Okay, we have Michael all the way from Oregon here.
Yeah, I didn't bring a book, but I brought a friend. I wanted to introduce to the class someone that they should know. Jeffrey Rosario is down at the end of this row here. He didn't know I was going to introduce him, and his wife Mariana. And maybe he would comment on a book he's read. You don't have to. You didn't know I was going to do this to you. But Jeffrey has just started a program of study towards a PhD at Cambridge University in history. Just finished a master's degree at Yale University in church history. Isn't that correct? And is interested in the uniqueness of Adventism early on and how it may have implications for current political goings-ons. Isn't that correct? More or less?
More or less, yes.
I don't know. Do you have a book you could summarize?
Well, he mentioned Douglas Morgan, so I think, I don't know if it's an oldie, I don't know if it's been covered in this class. Adventism in the American Republic, public engagement of a global movement or something like that. Douglas Morgan, anyhow, it's what inspired my current project, and I'm just drawing attention to the book because it's been blowing my mind recently in the way it's giving me insights into the trajectory of the church. And just one nugget that I'll share, though the book covers the church's development and progress as conscientious objection in military conflict, Civil War, World War I, World War II, all the way to modern times. But one of the points that was brought out is how the church receded from social protest, and I guess it goes along with your recommendation in Protest and Progress, but it talks about how in the Adventist eschatological imagination, there's this aversion to government overreach and power throughout history, and that's what has led to the suppression of truth or to the persecution of different religious groups. And so in the 20s, 30s, and in that period where different policies began to put into place in this country in order to alleviate social issues, maybe in the aftermath of the Great Depression and so forth, that Adventists saw that as government getting bigger and overreach and began to recede from supporting or engagement politically in social issues because it was seen as blending too much with, I don't know, the liberal left. The world, or, you know, the ecumenical movement and things like that. And so how it just basically led key leaders to swing the opposite direction. And it's really become sort of a window for me to understand the political makeup of the church today and its relationship to politics and to the surrounding world. So I'm beginning to look back into the early 20th century now to see how I think it's almost impossible to understand what the church is today without that key period. And Douglas Morgan has been huge in bringing that to light. So my current project is on Adventist anti-imperialism during the Philippine-American War, which Morgan introduced me to in that book. But in that book, he basically fleshes it out in 3 pages, which I think is crazy, because what he did in 3 pages, I think should open up an entire field of study of how Adventists allowed their views on prophecy to inform their social engagement. So that's what I'm doing right now in my project. I'm trying to carry the torch of Douglas Morgan in that respect, in showing how Adventist eschatology has huge potential to, I don't know, inform the church today to take a very, very balanced and very conscious role in the world.
Just get this up there.
What's happening here, without our really meaning to, is that we're getting a whole bibliography on Adventism and social issues, and especially racial issues. Now, another book that we should mention is, if you look it up on Amazon, you need to look under title Social Justice by Jonathan Thompson. But the whole title is actually The Enduring Legacy of Ellen G. White and Social Justice. And this is an interesting book because it was a conference that took place at Oakwood University, and all of these speakers gone back to Ellen White and gathered together all of the justifications for activity in social justice. So in Morgan's book, you can see where we lost that vision, but this book on social justice is trying to help us recover that vision. Social Justice, it's by Jonathan Thompson. Thompson was the curator or the director of the Ellen White Research Center at Oakwood. He passed away before this. He organized the conference and then passed away before it came out. But it's there for us to read.
Now, is that the Cambridge in Massachusetts or UK?
UK.
Okay, couldn't get into Harvard, huh?
Went to the real Cambridge.
I lived in Massachusetts, and of course, Harvard always said, we're not gonna let those Yaleys in.
Right. That's right.
We're gonna give you equal time.
This isn't so much a book review as something that was pointed out to me this morning that came out in the New York Times. About 16 years ago, I was listening to an NPR talk, and they were talking about a person named Robert Alter, who had recently finished a translation of the first 5 books of Moses. And Alter's kind of claim to fame in this was he claimed that there were problems in the English translation of the Hebrew Bible. He said that you had to pick between the King James Version, which seemed to have captured kind of the essence of the connotation and the spirit of the language, but had let a little bit of the accuracy slip. You had to pick between that and something like the New International Version, which had nailed the meaning, but had turned it into somewhat of a sterile textbook from his perspective. And so he had redone the first 5 books of Moses. He's a Hebrew literary critic at UC Berkeley, has written quite a bit outside of Scripture. One of his books called Pen of Iron traces the political and historical influences in and around the translation of the King James Version. But anyway, I managed to get a hold of a copy of that book those years ago and read through Genesis and Exodus. I didn't get much beyond that, but it really was different than anything I had ever read. It had a sense to it and a feel to it that was much more elegant, and at the same time seemed to really capture the deep meaning. And in addition, he of course has commentary mostly focused around the language and the literary constructs. as time went by, I had enjoyed it so much, I looked around and found another book he had written actually before that, actually translated, not written, and it's called The David Story, where he starts in Samuel, works his way through 1st and 2nd Samuel and first few verses in Kings, and it is the story of David, translated very literally, and yet when you read it, it makes Hollywood's Godfather figures look downright paltry. I read it to my kids, and they actually sit there as riveted as if I'm just reading some kind of entertaining literature. So, you know, it was very well done. So over the years, more and more of his translations have come out, and I've picked them up here and there. And this morning I was disappointed to find out that he has finally finished the entire Old Testament. And I'm disappointed because he has packaged it into 3 volumes, which of course means I now have a bunch of redundant books on my shelf. But I would highly recommend it. From the portions that I have read, there is no translation quite like it, and the commentaries are superb. And honestly, if you can turn 1st and 2nd Samuel into a read that rivals any novel and still be absolutely true to the text, it's a very impressive feat. So
Now,
for those who are interested, I'd recommend it.
The book and the author again?
Oh, Robert Alter. If you go onto Amazon and you type on Robert Alter, you'll get a whole list of things to choose from, but the one you're looking for is the complete translation of the Old Testament in 3 volumes. And it has commentary mixed in as well.
It's only $76, and for that much book, it's really worth it.
Yeah.
Spell altar for me. A-L-T-E-R. Altar. Altar.
You know, several years ago, when I was first introduced to the teaching company, the Great Courses, I started to read his, or listen to his material.
Well, I looked up Adventism in the American Republic. The cheapest one is used volume for $150. I don't know.
It's for free. It's available for free
Okay,
at the
tell me
Adventist Archives website.
Okay,
The ASTR, you know, David Trim. If you go under books,
okay.
download it for free as a PDF.
Okay.
Okay.
Should have
thank
mentioned
you.
that.
Let's-
Unless you got $200 to spend.
Okay, let me give my second book. This is called Deep Work. It's written by Cal Newport, who has written several books. How to be a straight A student, but it's really the time management. But he argues that too much of our life today is not deep. And one of the big causes is the internet, email, texting, and, drum roll here please, Facebook. And he's not objecting to Facebook for the same reasons that we've been hearing on the news. He just feels that there's too much time taken away from work. And he mentions in here people who will actually take their iPhone or whatever smartphone they have and stick it in a drawer and lock it up for maybe 2-3 hours. And then they take it out at a certain time and then look at it. The same way with Facebook. He mentions that Facebook, really all these friends, are they really your friends? He suggests they are not. Just trying to think, one other thing, am I getting too many, I got too many microphones here. We talk about multitasking, and he argues that you can't do it. That if you're doing something and then you're pulled away, oh, you look at your email or text. I'm just going to look at it's his thesis that it takes you 10-15 minutes to get back.
Yeah, fragmentation.
So he, again, he argues that that we need to start controlling this thing that 100 times a day we probably look at our phones. So anyway, it's a good book, Deep Work. It's an easy read. He's got some good examples in the back. And applies it to other situations as well. But Deep Work by Cal Newport. Now, David, I think you have. Oh, is there? Oh.
I just wanted to say that I'm discovering Steinbeck, and I'm really enjoying. I mean, just the amount of, like he was a keen observer of life, like the way that the cat's tail moves or the way that the sun is above, you know, at a certain angle. Like he's so good at describing it. I'm just really liking it. But I wanted to mention a book called How the Irish Saved Civilization by Thomas Cahill.
Aye.
Yes, excellent.
Okay, well that sounds like most of you.
Sounds like they're fans of it.
Sounds like you guys are fans. It was a really fun read and
true.
And yes, and
Well.
Well, it's like Ron said.
But it's a very good book.
It was
yeah.
really fun,
Yeah,
fun
it
to
is.
read, and it kind of was eye-opening with the Middle Ages and the way things panned out, and how the Irish were key in preserving the text when the rest of Europe kind of destroyed Roman literature and Greek literature. So I would recommend it.
Now, what was their first, were you talking about John?
John
I was
Steinbeck
talking-
and
yeah,
John.
Grapes of Wrath is what I'm
Grapes
reading.
of
Is there
Okay.
any other Great.
By the way, when I worked with the American Bible Society, I visited a lady. What is the city that is famous for Steinbeck? Salinas, yes. Anyway, she lived over by the ocean, and she was in her 90s then. This is 16 years ago. And she said, I knew John Steinbeck personally. She had a PhD in chemistry from Berkeley. And she actually would test all the food there that would come into the cannery. And she says, I know every one of those characters. And she would talk about them. And, but I have to say, one of the things I always admired, always remember, she was a good Presbyterian lady. And then every once in a while she'd forget and she'd say, oh hell. So anyway, but yeah, and by the way, they have a museum now in Salinas that finally was dedicated a few years ago by the minority mayor. So anyway, David. Okay.
Do we have time?
I think we have a little.
Okay.
We started a little late, but
You have 2 minutes.
2 minutes, but we'll give you 3.
Make up your mind.
I have a book that might surprise many, but I think it's excellent. It's called Thirst, and God and the Alcoholic Experience. It's written by James Nelson, who is one of the profound leaders of the Society for Christian Ethics. He did not drink at all growing up as a youngster in a Presbyterian home. He began to drink in college, and then he gave it up. But on a sabbatical at Cambridge, he started to go to the afternoon meetings where there's some alcohol served, and he got caught. And he was not able to escape that web. And so this is a theological reflection on alcoholism, but it's also an alcoholism look at theology. So he's going back and forth. And I think that anyone who knows anybody who's struggling with alcohol as an addiction would do well to read this. And there are many, many of us who know people of that struggle. And also, though, I think people who have no particular interest in alcoholism would find that Christianity becomes more understandable when we look at it from this point of view. James Nelson,
Okay.
and the book is entitled Thirst, God and the Alcoholic Experience.
Did you want to give your other one?
Oh, this one is an old book, but I think it's really worth going back to. It's by Thomas Sowell. It's A Conflict of Visions, the ideological origins of our political struggles. Basically, he is saying there are two different visions. One might think of one as Thomas Hobbes, right? If you look at him, he's really pinched and narrow and so forth. Then the other one is David Hume, who's very expansive. One a very pessimistic view of life, the other very optimistic view of life. And he sees these basic visions as primordial to our conflicts.
Now, was this one out of your father's library?
No, I got several of those, like The Shaking of Adventism.
Okay.
That was interesting to reread.
Okay, well, thank you very much. As you see, we don't really know what's going to happen as we discuss these books, and I think it's good that way. We get to take a look at a broader outlook on life, and I understand more clearly why Roy Branson enjoyed this type of experience. Now, next week you have another chance to bring some books. And again, It doesn't have to be the magnum opus or anything like that. It's something that has touched you or you feel is very important to your life or to those around you. So thank you again, and at this time we'll have our benediction. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. See you next week. And if you'd like to make a gift to the Roy Branson Legacy Sabbath School, see me. We have some tithe envelopes here that will help you do so.
So, spent the night in